Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad to see you. You make me proud to talk about crabs, because crabs have been good to me almost all of my life. And when I started preparing this little talk, I wondered how I could connect it with crabs. So I thought about that I can probably go back further than anyone in this room and talk about crabs. Because in 1930 or 31, my parents and I moved from Caesar, Mississippi to South Point, Louisiana. The South Point is at the south end of the Southern Railroad bridge that goes across Lake Pontchartrain. This was a very small community that you could only get there by boat or by train. They had about 14 houses there, and they had commercial fishermen and maybe one retired family and people that worked on the Southern Railroad. They repaired and maintained the bridge. Okay, this small community had about 14 houses that had, let's see, commercial fishermen and men that worked and people that worked on the Southern Railroad to maintain that bridge across the lake. My father had moved there because times were hard in Mississippi at that time, because at the time that's right in the Depression. I guess they call it the Great Depression now. So he moved to South Point so that he could do work on the railroad. Work as an extra person when someone wanted a day off. But shortly after that, he got a regular job as a bridge tender at the South Drawbridge. Now, you can only get to South Point by boat or by train. But he bought a house that was on pile over Lake Pontchartrain. The shoreline was right even with the front porch. And they had 4 porches on all 4 sides of the house. And fortunately for me, next door neighbor, which was about 50 feet away, was a commercial fisherman, Mr. Andrew Spieler. Now, Mr. Andrew Spieler, he fished crabs with a pirogue and drop nets. He would catch his shedding crabs in the Irish Bayou lagoon, and when the sun got up hot and kind of warmed that water up, the crabs quit biting there. So he would pick up his drop nets and he would come back to his house and put them out about 100 yards from the shore to catch hard crabs. He also shedded softshell crabs. And I was little, 7 or 8 years old, and I watched everything Mr. Andrew did. I liked him, and I'm sure he liked me, because he showed me and taught me how to tell a crab that was ripe. That's one that within 3 days of molting. And I watched him day after day, and maybe for a couple of years. And Mr. Andrew then had to move. He didn't have to move, but he chose to move to Slidell so his children could go to school. And so I was fortunate enough to have some drop nets that I put out on my porch. The water was usually clear, and all I needed to do is walk to the edge and see if there was a crab in it before I lifted it up. How did I bait it? Well, there were dirt dauber nests all on those porches. And knock one down, get that little worm out of there, put it overboard and catch hard-head catfish. That's what I use for bait. And I don't know how many crabs I caught, but I had fun catching them. Then one day my brother Ishmael, which was about a year older than me, we took those nets and went to where the bridge meets the shore, right at that point. We set those nets out, and in just a little while we had a bucket full of crabs. Brought them home. And I just imagine this. I think my dad saw those crabs and he gets an idea. He works out at Southshore and has lots of time. So he made a bunch of crab nets. I don't know how many, but to me it was a lot. And then he bought some kind of a skiff, an old skiff that leaked, and a pair of oars, and Ishmael would row the boat, and I would pick up the nets, and I would stand on the bow and pick up the nets with a forked pole, dump them in the boat. And I don't know how long we did that, but I know we did it for several years for this reason. At that time, there was no nylon, dacron, and this kind of stuff that lasted a long time. It was all cotton. So the cotton would deteriorate, and when I'd go to pick up one of the nets and the line broke, my feet was right together. Where do you think I went? Overboard. But I didn't mind, just climb back in, go again. So we did that for a while, and we're growing up. I don't know how many years we did it, but we were growing up. And my dad gets another idea. He gets Mr. Charlie Spieler, who was a bridge tender at the North Drawbridge, to build us, and he was also Mr. Andrews' brother. He built us a launch, 20 foot long, and installed a one-cylinder gasoline engine. And this was a direct drive. That meant when you cranked it, you better be headed the way you wanted to go. Because there was no reverse, no neutral. And coming into land, you better shut it off in time till it could coast into the thing. So he also built us about 100 crab nets. He made them the size that Mr. Andrew used to use. And Ishmael and I started running these nets. We would start about 100 yards from the shore on the west side of the bridge and go out toward the drawbridge. We'd put out about half the nets. We'd make a turn to the left, go out a couple of traps, and then go back parallel back to the place where we started. And then we would go make this long loop continuously as long as the crabs bit real good. If the crabs slacked off, we would stop a little while right at the beginning to give them a little more time to get in there. And that's the way we were running our traps, and we caught crabs pretty good. But he drove the boat, I lifted up the nets, because I guess we both got pretty good at what we were doing, so we kept doing the same thing. Now at the same time, there was a man that lived in New Orleans, and all I knew his name was Dipper. Now he was a commercial crab fisherman, and he had come out every Monday morning to Irish Bayou. He would bait his crab nets, and he would come and he would fish on the east side of the railroad bridge. And he would also pick up bait for us at the slaughterhouse in New Orleans. The bait was tripe. Some of you might not know what tripe is. That's the cow's stomach. We would cut it in pieces about the size of my hand, with a hole in the middle, and tie it in the middle of the trap. We used that bait because shark and big gars didn't like it. you use fish, you might lose your trap by being drug off by a shark or gar. That's what we baited our traps with. We also sold our crabs to Dipper. We would sell them by the hamper, of the hard crabs by the hamper, and he would pay us $1 a hamper. Now, a hamper consisted of 5 dozen crabs and 5 extra crabs. He also bought soft crabs because I shedded soft shell crabs too. We didn't catch very many, but we caught some double crabs, and he paid us $1 a dozen. But there's a little touch to that. It took 2 to make 1 of the medium-sized crabs. The large crabs took 3 to make 2. The jumbo crabs only took 1 to make 1. A dozen. But anyway, to us, that was a lot of money. And back then, you could buy a Baby Ruth candy bar or Butterfinger for a penny. So, let's see what happened next. I have to have these senior moments sometimes. I have a pretty good long-term memory, but short-term memory, it gives me problems. Oh, let's see. Okay. Ishmael and I continued to crab this way until he was drafted into the service. And when he was drafted into the service, I lost my helper. So I just went to school until in my junior year. I had just completed my junior year. And I was 2 years behind because I started school at age 7, and going to school, I never got to school any time from the 1st grade through junior high school, junior in high school, because I rode the train to school, and I never got there on time, not any time, always at least an hour late. So I missed reading, spelling. So then I couldn't make the grade on my good behavior. So I repeated the 4th grade. So I was 2 years behind. So when my junior year, I finished my junior year in May, just about my birthday, 28th of May. Then I was old enough that I started working on the railroad. I worked about a month, and I got my call to service. And then I was drafted into the service. I spent 31 months in the infantry. And I served my time in the South Pacific until the Japanese surrendered, and then I went for a short time to occupy Japan, and then back home. When I got back home, I was discharged with a 10% disability, and that was for having recurring malaria fever. That entitled me to qualify for Public Law 16, which the government would give me 48 calendar months of education, paying for books, supplies, tuition, and paid me $105 a month for subsistence. But since I got back in January and I wanted to finish my year in high school, I waited until September to go back to school. But in the meantime, I went back to work for the railroad. That was about 8 months. So in my total working life, that 8 months is the only time that I worked for somebody else. But anyway, when I was going to school my senior year, I met a very pretty girl. Her name was Frances Davis. We dated, and when we graduated in 1947, she went to Southeastern, I went to LSU. 2 years later, we got married. And that, my friends, was 64 years ago. There she is, my wife. We had 9 children that we raised. There was 3 girls and 6 boys. I worked in a lot of stuff, but we're going to bypass that because it didn't pertain to crabs. But I had moved to Lacombe in about 1953. I moved back to Lacombe, where my wife was born and raised. That's here. I worked at different places, but the crab traps was introduced in Lake Pontchartrain. And when they were introduced, and I heard that they were catching crabs real good, then I decided to do for my boys what my father had done for me. So I bought material and stuff to build crab traps, and built crab traps. Of course, they're old enough that they can do a lot and help me too. So we built crab traps. And I let them use my fishing boat, which was an outboard motor rig. And they started fishing crabs with crab traps. Well, in just a little while, my younger son, William, he bought a skiff, an outboard motor from his uncle. And he started fishing on his own. But there was no quarrel or anything. They just decided that it only took one person to fish with crab traps with outboard motor. So they divided up the crab traps and started building some more. And then they were in the crab trap business. They remember anything that I say about my children fishing crabs, we only fished in the summertime when they were not going to school. So then William, he decided he wanted to shed some softshell crabs. So since Mr. Andrew taught me how to shed softshell crabs, I started to teach him how. And while I was teaching him how and building crab boxes to put them in, I got the fever. What kind of fever? The crab fishing fever. I had done a lot of stuff. I'd done a lot of things in my life and successfully working for myself, but I'd never done anything that I enjoyed any more than fishing crabs. So I decided that I would shed some softshell crabs. I'm still building fiberglass boats in a building that I built behind the service station that I had built and operated for about 17 and a half years, and started building fiberglass pirogues and lake skiffs. But I let that sit by because I like the crab. So in order to catch shedding crabs, I decided I would build some habitat traps. So I built some habitat traps that were made just exactly the same size as a regular crab trap, except the height. They didn't have a middle section, and they didn't have a bait well. So I built them about 8 inches high, so that I could put mungo bushes in them, and when I threw it overboard, I didn't have to worry about how it landed, because upside down was as good as right side up. They worked real good for shedding crabs until a storm or hurricane or something came along, and my habitat traps wound up in the marsh, even in some duck ponds. So then I had to do something else then. So I started scooping crabs just like the other people were doing, with a net. It was about maybe 12 inches wide, and they would push it through the grass bed to spook the crabs out. But very often when a crab was spooked out, you've been pushing it through that thing, the net was full of algae. You start to scoop the crab, the water couldn't pass through the mesh of the net because the algae had it all blocked. It was like trying to scoop crabs with a bucket. So I looked at that thing real close, and then I started figuring out just maybe I can build something instead of being that narrow, build something that's 5 foot wide. And I push it through there and keep my net out of the water, so when the crab started to spook out of that grass, I could catch him, turn around and dump him in my pirogue behind me. Well, I built one, made it out of galvanized pipe, 1-inch galvanized pipe. Oh, I went down there and I was going to see how it worked. I put it in the grass, started trying to push it. I couldn't push it. It was too heavy. It just bogged down. Well, back to the drawing board. So I went to the drawing board. The first time that I made one, it was just like this one. This is one of them. It has a blade on the bottom, a rounded edge on the top. When you push it through the grass, that ribbon grass would roll over the top and draw it down right next to the bottom. And as I pushed it, then it would spook the crab out. And if by chance I ran into a little place that was a little bit too high and the pusher hung up on that, then all I had to do was just lower the blade a little bit and push it, and it would just ride over it. First shot, I never had to change one single thing, not one. Of course, when you're pushing it through there, the scoop net was held like this. When the crabs came out, you just reach and scoop him, turn around, put him in the pirogue. And it worked like a charm. We also called something else. I caught so many crabs, I had to build some more crab boxes. I've been building the crab boxes out of redwood. And I thought, well, maybe I can build one out of fiberglass. Well, I built one out of fiberglass. I'll describe to you how it was made, but now I have a picture of one of them. I'll show you the picture when I finish if you want to come by and look at it. This is it. It was 8 foot long, 3.5 foot wide. This is one where the soft crabs were in this one. The round holes that's in there is 1/4 of an inch holes. Now, it had to float. Fiberglass is heavier than water. So the way I worked that out, I put airtight compartments on every corner, and it would hold it up. So that worked good. But the first one that I built, I didn't have these small holes. I had, the holes were bored 2 inches apart with 1/2-inch drill. And a soft crab, when he shedded, he would hang on the side and let his legs hang out. These hard-headed catfish grab that leg and make that crab disconnect, just give him the leg. And I had a bunch of soft crabs, some of them with no legs and some of them with a bunch of legs missing. So the next one that I built, I made them 1 inch apart and 1/4 inch. That cured that. And by the time that I stopped fishing crabs along the lake shore, I had 3 of these, small ones for the shedding soft crabs, and 9 of the ones you put the green crabs in. Green crabs are one that's 3 days, from 3 days to 10 days of molting. And then, since this thing worked so good, I decided that I would build some pirogues. The pirogues that was wide and 14 foot long, especially to use to scoop crabs. I also built 5 of those nets, 5 pushers, so that I could get some boys that were out of school to push those things and scoop crabs and bring them in and sell them to me. Well, that's when I had to build all these extra boxes. But, I mean, it got to where I was kind of overloaded. I had to go through those green crab boxes and separate the ones that had advanced to the what we call ripe stage. Now it's red line stage. And I spent a lot of time just grading through crabs. And when the crabs were in the lake, they all had to be nipped. In other words, you just cut part of the bite and claw off so they couldn't bite one another and bite me too. So I spent a lot of time nipping crabs, grading through crab boxes. But you know, for some reason or other, the crabs fell off along the shore, along the grass bed. They fell off real bad, but at the same time, I'm watching my boys, and they're picking up. The hard crabs are picking up in the lake, and the shedding crabs are picking up and catching in the crab traps. So I decided that I would do some hard crab fishing too. So I went and had a man to build me a boat. It was Bill Butler at Mandeville, built what they call a clam boat. It was about 26 foot long, and I installed a diesel engine in it. And I started fishing crabs there, fishing hard crabs. So I was fishing hard crabs, I was shedding soft crabs. And every 4 hours in the summertime, we'd pick up the crabs, the soft crabs, or they'd get too hard. They'd be paper shell and lose their value. But I hated that night run more than anything else, because I had to ride from here down to the lake, go out, thunderstorm, mosquitoes, dark, and pick up the soft crabs. So then I started real seriously trying to figure out some kind of way that I could pick up those crabs in the afternoon, just at dark, bring them home, put them in a vat, and shed them so I wouldn't have to go down to that lake and get those crabs. Well, I built a fiberglass tank that was 8 foot by 3 foot. Put an aerator in it, brought the crabs that was going to shed before 12 o'clock, and the ones that was cracked somewhere, cracked open, ready to back out, brought them in there, put them in that vat. And they lived pretty good for a while, but then they would die. So I was still working, trying to, and I built a filter that just, if I brought some muddy water up there, it would filter that water, that mud out. But then I heard somebody say that over at Biloxi, Mississippi, they had a lady over there that could build a different filter. So I didn't let my shirt tail touch me till I was over there. And I met Harriet Perry. And she told me how to make a biological filter. Not only did she tell me how to make it, she offered to help me locate the material to make it with and help me make it, design it and make it. So in this building where I was building fiberglass boats, I had a room there, big room. I already had a mold that would make those live boxes. And I had a mold that would make a filter that was just 3 foot wide. I had everything just about it that I was already made that I could make this system. Well, I put it in this building, and that thing worked perfect. I shedded crabs. I could bring green crabs in there and bring them through the cycle. So then Harriet asked me if she could document it. Oh yeah, anybody that helped me out that much, we'll do anything for her. So I let her document the filters, and she published it. I didn't know at the time that she was also working with another man over at Biloxi. But that man wouldn't let anyone see his filter. He wouldn't, his system. He wouldn't let them see it. So I don't know why she chose me instead of him, but she did. And when she documented that filter, then Harriet and LSU got together and applied for some Sea Grant money to further investigate the filter. So then Dr. Ron Malone, he was a professor at LSU in the engineering department. Man, when I heard that, I thought, what the world, engineer working with crabs? Well, they knew what they were doing. They chose the right one. His specialty was teaching graduate students about water quality. So he knew all about water. You couldn't have got a better man to work with it. And he started, first of all, they had these workshops. Well, in the meantime, that place where I had that first system set up was about an eighth of a mile from my house. And I wanted it right in my back, right in my yard. So I built a building, pretty good size, and started building some systems in there. I would build the systems with 8, we'll call them trays, 8 trays. 4 on the top, 4 on the bottom. And I decided to build 3 of those. So if one system went out, I could take those crabs and divide them up between the other 2 systems until I could get those repaired. Well, the whole time, it never happened, but it was there. So that's the way I had it set up. And then that's when they started having the workshops, and the people all along the Gulf Coast, that is the people, each state has kind of a crab expert. And they would come so that they could observe it, and it really helped because it does a lot better when you can actually see the thing instead of somebody showing you a drawing. So for 3 years, they had that workshop. And then the 4th year, they had a workshop in Salisbury, Maryland. They invited me to go so I could talk about the filter. And they paid all my expenses. And then they had something, kind of a workshop up there. And then the next year, I think they had it at Gloucester Point, Virginia. And on this trip, I took my wife with me. They paid my expenses, but I took her with me. And it was like a real good vacation to go up there and see what they were doing, because I saw a lot of other stuff, and I already knew about the crabs. Then Dr. Malone asked me, he said, do you think maybe that we ought to stop because you might get an overproduction of crabs, of soft crabs? I said we might. So then all this time they're getting grants to do this research. And Dr. Malone, he had built different type of biological filters, and he asked LSU if they would patent it. They said they didn't want to. He said, you care if I do? No. So Dr. Malone, he took the patent himself, so he has a patent. So let's see now, where do we go from here? In the meantime, when all this is going on, we had problems in Lake Pontchartrain with shell dredging. The law required that the shell dredges stay at least a mile offshore and a mile from all bridges. But we still had conflict between fishermen and dredges, because those thieves would go 24 hours a day, and if they hit your trap line, they didn't pay any attention to that, they just destroy your traps. And not only that, they affected the men that wanted the shrimp, because that suction dredge, they would cut out a slip of maybe about 4 or 5 foot wide and that deep. As he went by and dredged that stuff up, got the clam shells out on the belt, go on the barge, and the other stuff, they'd kick it back overboard. The heavier stuff would kind of sink back down where it came from. But that lighter stuff would be suspended in the water column and go all over. Well, the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, they maintained and they used this phrase: shell dredging in Lake Pontchartrain causes no long-term detrimental effect. Well, I looked at that thing real close, and I said to myself, well, they're admitting that it causes a short-time detrimental effect. And when you figure that there's a bunch of them out there, maybe 7 or 8, and they're going 24 hours a day, 365 days, then wouldn't you think that that would cause a long-term detrimental effect? And that was still going on, and we started forming concerned crabbers. They had a chapter at Salt Bayou on the other side of Slidell. They had one here in Lacombe, one in Madisonville, and then we decided to go together and perhaps have a crab task force. It was a good idea. So we met up at, I believe it's Quail Drive in Baton Rouge, where Wildlife and Fisheries have their building. They elected me as what are called some kind of temporary chairman. And in high school, the FFA, I was on the parliamentary law team, so I knew a good bit about Robert's Rules of Order. So in just a little while, we had determined how we wanted to select the people to serve on the committee, how we could remove them if they didn't show up, and then other bylaws. So we established a crab task force. Now, I didn't know at the time, but it was really a illegal task force, because the shrimp task force, the oyster task force, the governor appointed the ones to serve on it. Well, we chose our own to serve on it. I was chosen to represent the soft crab industry. And we had other issues at the time besides the shell dredging. But somewhere along that line, and I don't remember where, but I'll give another example of the thing about the shell dredging. I read or heard something about New Orleans. The Orleans Parish had passed the law making the dredge boat move further than a mile away from shore. So when I heard that, I went before our governing body, and I don't know if it was police jury or councilman. It was sometime along that line where they were changing. But anyway, I went before them, and I told them and asked them if they would try to figure out something to make those dredges move further away from St. Tammany shore to give us more room to fish crabs. So I'm involved with the task force, and for some reason or other, the state made the dredges move out of Lake Pontchartrain. That was a pretty happy day for me. Now, we had another item that gave me real concern, and that was these escape rings and crab traps. Our crab expert, Mr. Vince Gildery, he did some research on it, and the vents really kept those small crabs out of the crab traps, which made it easier to comply with a 5-inch crab law. If there was 5 inches point to point, then it was, on the hard crab, it was illegal unless it was a shedding crab that had the signs of probably no more than 10 days away from molting. It had to be put in a box and labeled. Now, with these things, they were recommended mandatory use of these vent things. And it came up before the legislature, and for 2 times I had to do something that I really didn't approve of, but I just had to do it. This secretary, assistant secretary, was a marine biologist. The secretary was a political appointer, and they had 2 of these secretaries, one that represented the game industry and the one that represented the fishing industry. So since I had served on a coastal advisory committee for St. Tammany Parish with this one, then I asked him to do what he could do to stop this, because the Crab Task Force had voted to ask the government to pass the law. Well, he fixed it so it wouldn't even come up. 2 years later, it came up again. My wife and I graduated with one of the senators. This is a senior moment. I can't think of his name now. But he was a good friend. I presented it to him, and he managed to stop it in the Senate. 3rd time around, I'd run out. So I went to my representative, Mr. Pete Snyder. He was on the Natural Resources Committee. Is anyone signaling me to stop?
I'm going to let you finish your story, and then we'll get on.
Thanks. So I explained the whole situation to him. He asked me to go before the Natural Resources Committee and present my arguments on that. So I did. And then when I went back home and it was and they started the whole house voting on it, he called me on the telephone. He asked me a few questions. I don't remember what he asked me, but I answered them. And they voted. But you know what? He added an amendment to it. And this is mandatory for the state. He added an amendment to it to exempt Lake Pontchartrain. And that passed. Until this day, we don't have to put the escape vent in our crab traps. The reason I objected to it so much, it let out the crabs that we were going to make soft crabs with. We had no problem complying with the 5-inch crab law because people fishing there, the crabs, we don't catch near as many, but we catch better crabs. And we grade through our crabs as we catch them. If they're not a shedding crab, back overboard they go. If they were a shedding crab, we put them in the prospective boxes like they were supposed to be. We complied with the law. And so I was getting older. At 75 years old, at that time, believe it or not, I was fishing with 1,200 crab traps. Oh yeah, there was talk that they were going to limit the number of crab traps. And oh, I was real concerned. Out of that 9 years that I spent there, I missed one meeting. I was in the hospital. My wife was with me every time at the meeting. So, but anyway, I decided that it was time for me to stop fishing all those crab traps. It was too much shedding soft crabs. So I decided, since I'm not a crab fisherman anymore, I'll resign. When I resigned, I was the last charter member to resign. And that was in the year 2000. And I hear a while ago that they changed it. They put it back where it was really legal. But I don't think it's nearly as good when you got politicians running things pertaining to fishing crabs, shrimp, or anything else as you do if you have men that are in the business. But I resigned in the year 2000. And I'm happy today. I'm still involved. Last year, I had two of my boys were still fishing crab. Oh, and by the way, all 6 of those boys went through that same cycle of fishing crabs. Every one. And they still went to school. So, I guess that'll wind it up. Now, if you would care to see a picture of one of the things, and if you look in the background, you will see a bunch of those crab boxes standing up on the edge, and they are separating bins for compost. Where I put it in one, transfer it to another one. Then I have another picture. I have a picture of this pusher. I have a picture of 3 different pirogues, fiberglass pirogues that I made. And you can see the wide one that I referred to.
Come up and see them in a few minutes.
And is there any more? Just 3 of them?
Is that the 3?
Yeah, that's the 3 pirogues. I got one here. Okay. Well, I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Oh,
We
you're
enjoyed
welcome.
that. Now, everyone, you will get a chance